In the late 2000s, an MSNBC documentary introduced the world to a Kentucky inmate named Fleece Johnson. He became an internet meme for his infamous comments on the central importance of booty to inmates. Fleece's shameless description of sexually assaulting other men to alleviate his own needs haunted a generation of young black men. He became something of a cultural icon when the popular television show, The Boondocks, turned him into a character called the Booty Warrior. What neither the MSNBC documentary nor the Aaron Magruder cartoon disclosed is that the Booty Warrior was the product of a conspiracy overseen by elements of the United States government. Fleece became the Booty Warrior because one of the prominent queer cartels in Kentucky was looking to cultivate a mid-level bull queer to establish a strong presence among the state's black population, which is crucial to winning the vote in Louisville. A brief exposition of bull queer theory is necessary for us to proceed forward. Bull queers are physically, financially, and sometimes intellectually dominant men who use homosexual force and homosexual blackmail to control other men. The queer cartel is the network of individuals who are under the thumb of the preeminent bull queer. There are lesser bull queers who help to organize the queer cartel and treat some of the members as if they were a part of their own smaller queer cartel. I know that this is all correct due to my own investigations, including missions where I have visited the era of the Founding Fathers, when American queer cartels first entered the scene of national politics. At this point, I call it a theory, because I am still ironing out the terminology and I am still in the process of proving that bull queers and queer cartels have long been a feature of society and they go back into the distant past. Since the time of President John Adams, there have been multiple competing queer cartels in American politics competing for dominance. Not every president has been a bull queer at the head of a queer cartel, but many have. Quite a few presidents have been puppets of bull queers or they have had their agenda stymied by queer cartels. Corporate America also has bull queers and queer cartels, although typically on a somewhat smaller scale than the political cartels. States, cities, and counties often have small-scale bull queers running affairs. Prisons, of course, also have bull queers, although they rarely have the subtle network of influence that a more exalted bull queer would yield. In this case, I would like to draw your attention to the bull queer side of Kentucky politics in the 1970s and 1980s. Like much of the rest of the American South after era of desegregation, there was a shift in partisan alliances in Kentucky. It was far less pronounced than in much of the rest of the South, as the voters took a couple of decades to shift their allegiance away from the Democrats to the Republicans of Nixon and Reagan. In fact, Kentucky voted twice for Bill Clinton in the 1990s, even after the triumph of the queer cartel at the heart of this story had already taken over the state. Much of the reason behind the unique resilience of the state-level Democrats in a state that has gone ruby red in national elections lies in the strength of a couple of Democratic bull queers and owes something to the shortcomings of the preeminent bull queer of Kentucky. Out of fear for my safety, I shall not name this bull queer. However, anyone who has some basic investigative skills should be able to figure out his identity based on the clues that I have provided. I strongly recommend against contacting or crossing this man. Even as his grip on Kentucky, the United States, and his own mortality weaken, he remains a cagey and dangerous individual. So far as I know, this queer cartel is like all of the others in that it has no name, save for that of its leader. The MK Ultra program, which began in the 1950s and was spearheaded by the CIA, was at heart an investigation into the possibilities of using mind control. This included everything from basic conditioning, which is not too different from how dog owners train their puppies, to the use of drugs such as LSD, to mind control by either psychic or technological means. One of the more extreme manifestations of MK Ultra was the attempt to use chips to enhance control over behavior and stimulate natural psychokinetic abilities, the rather lazily named Super Soldier program. By and large, although there were some improvements over the 2 or so decades of the program, it was not exactly a smashing success. Many of the men and women who were selected failed to demonstrate any improvement despite expensive training and supplementation. A fair amount of recruits either died in training, broke down during missions, or suffered from psychological damage for the rest of their lives. A less discussed minority of participants in the program did gain enhancements, but lost their hold on self-control and sanity. Nazi scientists, who were not exactly known for their ethical scruples, often formed the nuclei for many of these projects. They conferred their sense of right and wrong to their various acolytes. While most of the original scientists who had once served the Third Reich were retired or dead by the dawn of the 1980s, their students were still among us and seeking employment. With the government pulling their funding, the second-generation MK Ultra researchers, almost all of whom were true believers in the project's potential, sought to continue their work. Quite a number of them settled into mundane civilian roles and wallowed in discontent over their pet project's death. Some, however, continued to market their resumes to unscrupulous medical research companies. A lucky few were able to secure lucrative employment by organizations which were just as secretive and willing to pay top dollar for what amounts to mad scientist work. The organization which employed a small cadre of these evil white coats was a queer cartel in Kentucky which was in the process of ruthlessly crushing all of its competitors. Jerome Fleece Johnson, born in 1958 in Lebanon, Kentucky, moved to Louisville as a child. His family was impoverished and he did not have many opportunities to find a place in the world without resorting to criminal activity. Throughout his adolescent years, Fleece was in and out of juvenile detention centers. Seemingly, he learned few lessons as he kept getting busted for the same crimes over and over. However, more keen observers noted that his crimes were becoming increasingly refined and sophisticated, which was a sign of his intelligence and potential. Fleece stole his first car at age 12 as part of a gang initiation. By the following year, he had nickel-plated .45 pistols and he would rob craps games. By the time that he turned 14, Fleece Johnson was a well-known and feared criminal. The teenage Louisville resident amassed quite a rap sheet before reaching his majority. When he came of age, there was a chance that he would be able to turn things around and walk a different path, but that was not to be. A nefarious faction in Kentucky politics had long cast longing eyes on Fleece Johnson, who might very well be the key element who would make their queer cartel complete. Fleece, who had a natural aversion to authority, had no interest in being a part of any organization that he did not control. His would-be handlers did not care about his consent. It is unlikely that Fleece ever had the opportunity to play organized sports, participate in a spelling bee, or run for student council. However, he would get to be a part of a more exclusive association, MK Ultra. At this point, Fleece almost certainly had no interest in politics, but certain politicians had their eyes on him. While he was not well educated due to growing up poor and spending his time doing crime, Fleece had a high IQ and a capacity for leadership as he would demonstrate on many occasions. Later in prison, Fleece would innovate by figuring out how to store his feces and use it as a biological weapon. He was also able to improvise a flamethrower at one point. After some particularly brutal fights, where Fleece inflicted serious harm on a guard, he found himself in solitary confinement for over a decade and he educated himself by becoming a voracious reader. He was able to use his knowledge to file lawsuits which ended up costing the Kentucky Department of Corrections a great deal of money. Famously, of course, Fleece became a master of what he terms booty talk, which is persuading another man to voluntarily give up his body. The task before these second-rate, second-generation scientists was to create a small army of enforcers for the queer cartel of the rising marvel out of the bluegrass state. One of the men whom they whisked away from prison to their private facility was none other than Fleece Johnson. The goal was to meld him into a mid-level bull queer who would focus on enforcement and the employment of force to compel obedience. In order to accomplish this, they would have given him the standard package of super soldier enhancements. This included muscle stimulation to add to his atomic-level strength, brain stimulation to activate any latent psychokinetic powers and also enhance his speed of thought and reaction, and pain inhibition training, which would enable him to sustain damage and continue to fight effectively. Some evidence of Fleece's enhancements include stories of him performing prodigious feats of strength for a man of average height and build, such as pulling sinks and toilets out. Despite not being a lawyer or someone with more than a minimal education, Fleece also demonstrated the ability to outmaneuver his captors and play the rules of the game well enough to get rewarded after behaving badly. It is also apparent that in his surface-level hunt for booty, he was really building up a queer cartel. Much of his discontent stemmed from the fact that he was not getting directions to keep him focused on a larger goal, and his bull queering was taking place in a small pond where his talents were unable to really flourish. His handlers planted a fake memory in him of a juvenile rape when he was a 16-year-old in a prison with all white men over the age of 30. This was the life lesson that he has cited in subsequent interviews about when his quest for prison booty began. In reality, Fleece may have had 1 or 2 consensual encounters with older men, but his fierceness was enough to keep most potential sexual predators at bay. It is hard to say how many of his early memories are genuine and how many were planted by MK Ultra personnel. He claims to have inflicted extreme violence in the Kentucky prisons in an era when the white wardens were more than willing to slap additional sentences on black criminals, yet Fleece claims that many of his most heinous offenses were overlooked. Although the lack of documentation on such matters prohibits me from being able to prove it, I strongly suspect that most of these incidents where Fleece enacted extreme violence with no legal repercussions were memory plants designed to give him the confidence to engage in bull queer behavior. Had Agent Fleece Johnson been treated with the respect accorded to most SSP operatives and had his trainers taken his psychological state and background into account, he may well have become one of the truly legendary figures in America's secret history. Unfortunately, while the fools who created the Booty Warrior had the technical skills to manipulate his mind, they did not have the wisdom to consider his needs and what would be required to keep him on the right path. Anyone with sense examining his record would have noted certain things and made some easy course corrections. In 1979, Fleece Johnson, then 21 years old, was arrested for armed robbery. This was his first major crime as an adult and the start of his long sojourn in the Kentucky prison system. Once incarcerated, he continued to engage in violent brawls. At this point, when the queer cartel captured him for his special retraining, they should have known that he would be a long-term project. The kind of counseling that he would need to curb his extreme aversion to authority and his predilection for violence would take at least 2 to 3 years. It behooves queer cartels to remain hidden, so allow me to share a nugget of MIB wisdom. No responsible agent in charge would recruit and employ as an agent or asset anyone with Fleece's psychological makeup, much less strengthen the man before beginning to try to direct him. Fleece was also enrolled in a course on making explosives and improvised weapons. The unreformed criminal saw the queer cartel as recruiting him to be their leader, and when they explained that he would start off a low-level enforcer and would have a cap on his rank due to his race and criminal history, Fleece exploded in anger. During his attempt to break out of his training camp, Fleece killed a scientist and a guard, while badly wounding another scientist before he was eventually taken down by a barrage of rubber bullets. The beating that he took was so severe that he nearly died. As Fleece's vitals slowly recovered, his would-be recruiters decided to settle on a kind of mercy, as decided to wipe his memory and send him back to prison. Given that their science complement was now undermined, they most likely did not do a very thorough job removing his implants, which accounts for why he retained the physical skills imparted to him by the Super Soldier program. In prison, his initial sentence of 10 years turned into 40 as he got into brawls with other inmates and guards. Once, during a court hearing, he got into a brawl after someone doused him with urine. This earned him 3 of the years that he ended up serving. In one of his most notorious brawls, he sank his teeth into the arm of a man he was fighting and nearly murdered him by clamping down, like a pit bull. Having such bite strength and clamping onto a much larger opponent the way that he did shows the combat instinct that survived from his super soldier training. The prison system removed his teeth, and to this day he is not allowed to get dentures since his teeth are classified as a deadly weapon. In June 2016, after about 35 years in prison, Fleece was released. However, within a few days, he was caught attempting an armed robbery and ended up back in prison. Refusing to brook any disrespect from anyone, Fleece felt certain that he would never see freedom. Fleece Johnson was recently released from prison and now spends much of his time doing interviews on YouTube. He claims that he never took other men against will and that he exaggerated in his infamous MSNBC interview for the purpose of scaring kids straight. The booty warrior is, according to Fleece, an example of media sensationalism. To this day, he remains convinced that the only conspiracy that he has suffered is that the prison officials put him in front of the MSNBC cameras in order to make sure that he would be notorious and unable to get by once he was given his freedom. In his infamous interview, Fleece offhandedly and inadvertently told us who he is when he said, "I am warrior." Warriors without wars tend to struggle to find direction, as this nation found out during the Vietnam War era. We should have some sympathy for Fleece, as he was not only the produce of an unfortunate childhood, but a victim of unethical government experiments. Given the compulsions that drive him, whatever their origin may be, we must be careful to never forget that the booty warrior remains a dangerous man, even as he nears the age of 70. If Mr. Johnson is to be believed, and we cannot know how much of his mind is still his own, he is now a warrior for the rights of inmates rather than booty.